What's up, guys? It's bluetea-TCG back with another Vanguard deck profile / locals report. This time for V Premium once again. This is going to be my deck profile and locals report for Celestials, which I brought to locals this past weekend. I went 1 and 2 with it, so not as good as the previous weekend with Protect 2 / Curiel, but we'll go over kind of what went wrong with this build and what my matchups were, what I could have done better, and all of that in this video. If you guys haven't already checked out my previous deck profile / report for V Premium Angel Feather, which I did on Protect 2 / Curiel, please do so. The link will be in the description. And also, I highly recommend checking out my previous deck profile for Celestials in V Premium, which I did around when that deck had first been available to use, which was earlier in the year. All right, without further ado, let's go right into the deck profile. So we're going to start with the starter, and then the grade zeros and trigger units. So to start off, we've got one copy of First Aid Celestial Peniel. Enough said, you draw a card, you get a quick shield if you go second. Nothing much else to say. All right, and then for the trigger units, starting off, we've got 4 copies of Transcendent Divider Cassiel, which is the Heal Guardian. I'm kind of a broken record with regards to Heal Guardians and kind of the trigger lineup for Angel Feather in general, but you do want to have Heal Guardians these days because a lot of the good decks right now can rush you really fast, starting from when they first ride to grade 3. So you need a means of defending without using too many cards in hand from early on, especially for a deck like this, which doesn't really build too much of a big hand size, especially when we go for the full combo of the restanders. And, of course, Ramiel herself does give you back some card advantage by allowing you to draw cards based on how much you restood, but that's simply not enough to counteract the amount of cards we're spending from hand in order to assemble the combo in the first place. So you do want to be able to guard a few cards in hand where you can, and this is one of the ways we can accomplish that, especially when we are going second and being rushed by our opponent who's on their grade 3 turn with the massive power spikes. So this is a necessary means for that. You can also decide to run the 20k shield heal triggers, but I do think this is solid for these aforementioned reasons, so I am sticking with it personally, and I think I would highly recommend this for most Angel Feather builds these days. Now for the next set of triggers, we've got 4 draw PGs. So this hasn't changed really. This kind of deck can actually run, this deck can afford to run a couple more crits if you'd want. So you can run Munkar, which is the crit sentinel instead of these 4 crits. Now, the interesting thing about Battle Cupid Nociel herself is that because she allows you to draw, this does allow you to see your combo pieces necessary to pull off the full restand with the higher success rate. So I do like having the 4 draw PGs personally, but at the same time, you don't need so many perfect guards, especially if you go Protect 1. So you can decide to exchange this for more crits, such as Munkar or any other crits that's available. Although, of course, if you're subbing out a draw PG, you should definitely put in some crit sentinels. Now, keep in mind that if you do have more crit sentinels, you might be forced to Protect 1 for more matchups. And for me personally, I did not mind having these additional draw PGs at all. Although I will say at my locals, I did face more Excel decks than not. So I suppose there is reason enough to run a couple of crit sentinels instead and just rely on that, or just go Protect 2. Although I went Protect 1 all day this past weekend, so it wasn't really like I was forced to go to Protect 2 at any point. I didn't feel like it was necessary. And then last but not least, for our trigger lineup, you guys would probably expect this at this point. We've got 8 criticals, 4 of which being Hotshot Celestial Samyaza, and the other 4 being Pinky Denturist. So these are 8 criticals. We need criticals for this deck because I'm going to be honest, for this exact build, you probably don't need criticals for the actual combo, but you do want criticals just to surmount some form of pressure and to punish also a lot of no guards that people typically do early game. This is because we have, and you guys will see once we get to the nitty gritty of this deck build, but we have a means of kind of high rolling our opponent with the full Ramiel setup, where we have 2 Sanitize Raisers restanding, each attacking again for 3 critical twice each. And with that, if we have another critical trigger on them, and usually when you go for Sanitize Raiser, your opponent will be at 3 or 2 damage already, and then you heal them back to 2 or 1. then having an extra critical on them from the drive check means that they'll be able to kill with a lot more effectiveness than they would just by themselves with the 3 critical and 10k power that they give to themselves. So I do like the criticals here for that reason. You know, it just gives us some additional pressure, and you know, you can control how you give your opponent damage still, but of course I think Angel Feather just doesn't have much as far as options go anyway. You probably just have to run the criticals, as you see here, at minimum. You can of course decide to run the additional Sentinel crits as I mentioned before with Battle Cupid and Nociel. But that's going to do it for the trigger lineup. Let's see the grade 1s now. So the grade 1 lineup is a little non-standard, but it's kind of necessary to be like this because Celestials require a bit specific of a deck build, and there's just not a lot of space for all the typical cards that you run for Angel Feather and V. So we're starting off with the basics still. We've got 3 copies of Nakir. Now, this is, yes, a basic. You know, you run grade 3 searchers in most V decks these days, but we're not running the 4 copies simply because we just don't have the space. I could not find space for the 4th copy before the local happened last weekend. And in hindsight, like, I don't even regret not having the 4th copy of this because I was able to find Ramiel super easily, like every single round that I had. In fact, the one round where I had trouble riding up was incidentally riding into grade 2. It was a little funny and weird at the same time. You know, normally this deck has no problem riding into grade 1 and 2 because we're running a lot of them, but for grade 3s that's a little trickier, and I did end up G-assisting into grade 2, which is not the time you want to G-assist, but at the same time, you know, it happens. It's just the game of Vanguard. So we have the grade 3 searchers to stabilize and find the Ramiels, and potentially the Ramiel reverse if you haven't found that as well. And then, of course, you can also use the grade 3 searchers to find a Heal Guardian if you haven't seen those already, and you know you're going second. Or, you know, you just want a Heal Guardian early game. Those can be valid reasons. Now, I will say that Nakir being a 13k booster is really good for this deck in particular, but I haven't found it to be like valuable enough to warrant putting the additional copy in damage zone for the full Ramiel setup, which is why, again, I'm running only the 3 copies instead of the 4. But maybe after I test this deck a little more, I would decide to increase this to 4, and you guys can decide to increase this to 4 if you're more comfortable with that as well. But before the local last weekend, and again, even when I played the rounds, I did not find myself thinking like, oh, I need this additional Nakir, and because I didn't have this additional Nakir, I lost. No, I don't think that ever was the case last weekend. So I'm comfortable with this 3 copies, but of course you can decide to change this to 4 or 0 or whatever number you'd like, and it should be just fine. Next up is a card that I think is not as flexible, especially in terms of running it in this deck. It's 4 copies of Nursing Celestial Narelle. Now, this card I think is so important for any Celestial strategy in V. At least Celestial. When I say Celestial, I mean a strategy that involves Ramiel, of course, because for all intents and purposes, Celestial. You can run Celestial cards in other decks, but there's no good reason to run Celestial cards in other decks unless those Celestial cards are like generic, like Sariel is technically generic, as well as Raguel, and those happen to be among the best Celestials anyway. So that's what I mean by Celestial here. Narelle, you have to probably run in most Celestial builds just because it easily allows you to search out the Celestial you're missing from your damage zone, and it allows you to also build your Soul Engine and some draw power as well. So this really helped out in my early games in each of my rounds. And then whenever I opened this, I usually kept it if I also had another grade 1 to ride, and it just built some early tempo for me and allowed me to also get that much closer to fulfilling the full board, like the full ideal board for, you know, the best Ramiel turn that this build in particular has. So loving this card. If you guys aren't familiar with what it does, I explained it in more detail in my previous Celestial deck profile, so feel free to check that out. I won't go into as much detail for this deck profile because I do want to focus on the report, and this build is also a little different than that previous build. Not necessarily because, oh, we got some new cards. Yes, we did get new cards, of course, since then, but the reason I changed the build was more so to just experiment a little more with Celestial since I hadn't played them in quite a long time. And someone had commented some time ago, I think it was a couple months ago, that I should do a Celestial deck profile for premium. And this is kind of the setup for that eventual video, so I do want to make sure to cover these cards in their totality before then. So this is just so you guys are kind of primed with what these things do, and there's no surprises once that video is to release. But Narelle is so good and important for the setup, and it also builds your card economy, hand advantage, your and the names inside the damage zone that you're looking for if you're missing them. So I love that card in the deck. Love keeping it at 4. Next up is another card that we kind of see very often in a lot of Angel Feather builds in V right now. It is 4 copies of Scaling Angel. Scaling Angel does what almost no Angel Feather card does these days, which is interact with your drop zone and the damage zone. It's the basically the impeccable connection between the zone that angels are forbidden to touch and the zone with which angels must interact in order to, make anything productive happen in this card game. And Scaling Angel happens to tie those two together so elegantly, which is why we have to run the 4 copies, especially for a deck like this, which is essentially a combo deck that sets up the damage zone with very specific cards. And if you happen to discard those cards early on, you want to be able to put them back into the damage zone from the drop zone without having to worry too much. But actually, the most important purpose of this card is to build your soul, similar to how Narelle does. And because cards like Narelle and this card do both of those, it basically kills 2 birds with 1 stone, and it makes it an even more viable candidate to put in this build, which is why we're running it at 4 copies. Now, in terms of its being the go-to ride target, I did ride this. I did ride this once as my first grade 1 ride this past weekend, and that was when I went second. But also, that was the only time I had kept it in my hand because I knew that I was going second and would want to discard the Quick Shield off of this to draw a card when placed on Vanguard Circle. Really helped out for seeing additional pieces, and in fact, during that game that I had essentially full combo on my first grade 3 turn. And sadly, because I went second, it's not a terrible thing necessarily, but because I went second and my opponent had 3 PGs, I believe it was, I wasn't able to fully kill him off. 3 PGs is not something you commonly see, but all the same, you just got to be ready for certain things that spell the end for a deck like this. But that's for later in the video. Let's kind of focus back to Scaling Angel itself. As I mentioned, because we're able to set up the damage zone from the drop zone with this card, we need to make sure to have this in our hands at some point. So you do want to make sure that if you see it, you don't necessarily guard with it right away as a high priority. You do want to make sure to try to keep it if you can, because it's necessary to help out with all that the Celestials focus on with their strategy of setting up specific names in the damage zone. All right, and then finally for our grade 1 lineup, we've got 3 copies of none other than Bellyful Meds Angel. Again, I just love this card, especially for this deck. We need the soul, guys. This deck burns through soul like it's candy. I'm not even joking. Like, literally in my round 3, I think I lost because I ran out of soul. By the time I got to my second grade 3 turn, I had enough soul for just a restand from Ramiel, basically, and that means my Sanitize Raisers were just vanillas, 8k vanillas, which is terrible. So you need the soul from cards like this and Scaling Angel, etc. Now, the swapping for this deck is useful and very important. So, don't underestimate the power of being able to get the necessary card that you're missing in your damage zone because you already have the names, let's say, for example. But the value of just being able to swap and get a card in your soul, and then we're able to repeat this by soul blasting it out for our cost and then bring it back with Scaling Angel into the damage zone, or a card that you'll see later when we get to the grade 2s, Raguel. Raguel is able to bring this back for immediate value, which is just phenomenal as well. So Bellyful, 100% needed for this deck, guys. It just boosts the utility and flexibility like by a huge margin. And we'll talk about some alternative cards towards the end of the video for the grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3 lineup, but I mean, I do not see myself replacing this ever for a build like this, especially, and for a number of Angel Feather builds in V as well. So, great card. Going to continue running it, and 3 copies is kind of the optimal ratio for its hard once per turn, but we're not, at the same time, we're also not too concerned with trying to see it right away from the beginning of the game. We just need it to continue the soul engine and perhaps swap into a card that we need from the damage zone, or get a card from our hand that we, you know, are missing in terms of names in the damage zone for Ramiel into the damage zone. So that's the kind of the unique purpose that it fulfills, along with Scaling Angel. So now for the grade 2s, we're going to start out with the card that, again, has been beat to death in terms of how much I talk about it, 4 copies of Japhkiel. I'm really not going to go into detail on this card any longer. If you guys are not familiar with how powerful of a card she is, please do check out my previous Angel Feather deck profiles. Or, you know, maybe eventually I'll make like a, you know, an Angel Feather super video where we just talk about the clan's best cards, what the clan does, and the numerous strategies that are available, so that, you know, I can just throw this card down and then say we're moving on to the next card. But regardless, I'm pretty sure you guys kind of understand the value of Japhkiel at this point. All right, and then next up, we've got 4 copies of Sariel. This is a card we cannot skip on, especially for Celestials. This literally searches any normal unit on top of having a Celestial name, which basically automatically makes it the best grade 2 for a Ramiel-based strategy, especially in Celestials, especially in V. You know, we can say especially for a number of reasons, but Sariel is that card that fulfills all those purposes. And it turns out as well that the boost ability, the second ability that is, actually does come up for this deck, because we rarely have face down cards in our damage zone at any point. They're basically immediately countercharged, whether it's through Bellyful Med's Angel, or, you know, Japhkiel refunding the counterblast by itself, or if it's from Ramiel, which actually inherently countercharges on attack. So keep that in mind, guys, that, you know, we're going to have at most maybe 1 face down damage in our damage zone, which is still enough for the boost ability to be online, which also means that that's fewer cards that we need to worry about to have in our damage zone in order to restand with 4 restanders to, you know, get the maximum effectiveness off of Ramiel. Usually the columns I like setting up, and, you know, actually let me talk about the next card before we get into that. So yeah, 4 copies of Sariel. You're going to usually be searching this. You know, in terms of like cards you search in their order, I usually like searching Ramiel if I don't already have that, because we're running only 4 of her, and she's one of the only grade 3s we're actually running. We don't have many grade 3s in this deck, so we need to find the grade 3 first as, you know, the high priority if we don't already have that, just so that we don't get grade stuck. We find Ramiel as highest priority. The second card that you usually search is going to be Sanitize Raiser, or your grade 2 restander of choice. I choose Sanitize Raiser for this build. In the previous build I had for Celestials, I chose Hygienist Angel just because the meta was a little slower, and you know, Hygienist Angel just gets bigger and bigger of a number as the game goes longer, so it made a lot of sense. But I do think there's still reason to run Hygienist Angel as the restander of choice. But here I'm running Sanitize Raiser, so you have your Sanitize Raiser. You make sure you get that as a second priority off of Sariel. And then the third priority is any other card that you're trying to boost with that potentially you need in your hand for when you do in your Ramiel turn. Now keep in mind, you need to have cards that also get you there, meaning that give you the card back to your hand. So you can't just put it in the damage zone and expect it to come to your hand someday. You need to have a way of getting there. So if you don't have a way to get there, typically not worth using Sariel's ability, because that soul is so precious. And if you run out because you miscalculated or you didn't plan well enough for your combo, then you're just going to be a sitting duck after you attempt to go into your restand combo and realize that, oh, I don't have enough soul. Now I'm dead because my turn was not threatening enough. So do keep that in mind, guys, that soul is very important to manage, and you want to be, you know, while you do want to be liberal with Sariel, you also just want to be cautious. You want to make sure that you have a plan, you know, well thought out for when you're searching stuff. But typically the priority is Ramiel, then your restander of choice, and then any other card that you're going to be boosting with. All right, and speaking of restanding cards, we've got 3 copies of Sanitize Raiser as our restander of choice. Now, this is the one regret I have, okay? I will just say this right off the bat. I wish I had run 4 copies of this card going into this past weekend. I did not get really punished that hard for it running 3 copies, because I did happen to have all 3 copies set up each and every game, which is just funny. That's usually just a high roll. That's not necessarily 100% guaranteed. But having 3 means that you will get the full restand and full capabilities of Ramiel usually. Now, of course, you still need to have the 2 boosters, and, you know, ideally they would both have the same name, so you can just have fewer cards to set up in general. But in my case, I had the 3 Sanitize Raiser every round. I just didn't have the 3 boosters every round, so or 3 of the booster names, between the damage zone and the field every round. So that's what made it a little bit more troublesome in terms of actually following through with the pressure that I had put on my opponent with this card. But this card is being used as a restander simply because it's able to get 3 crit right from the get-go. Your opponent does not even need to be at grade 3. It reads, if your Vanguard is grade 3, we Soul Blast 1, your opponent heals a card from their damage zone, and this unit gets plus 10k and 2 crit until end of turn. Now, a major issue with this card is that it's Soul Blast 1 as cost, which, as I already told you guys, Soul is so precious, and this card is the main reason why this deck burns through Soul so much. If we didn't run this card as the restand of choice and we instead ran Hygienist Angel, I do not think this deck would have a problem at all with Soul, even though it would seem like it because, Ramiel herself Soul Blast, as well as Sariel, and even Narelle, even though Narelle, refunds the Soul right away. But this card is kind of the main reason why we run out of Soul so fast. Pretty much every turn we're going negative in Soul, so you want to make sure that you actually finish off your opponent. Otherwise, you have to have a way of getting that Soul back with Scaling Angel or Bellyful Meds Angel to help out, or simply rewriting, because I do actually think that in my round 3 match, because I never was able to rewrite, that was part of what made me have low Soul during that game, because not being able to rewrite means that's one fewer card in your Soul. Not to mention that the Ramiels, when on Rearguard Circle, actually give you Soul as well when you're at 4 damage when they activate their auto abilities. We'll get to that soon. But all these kinds of things do add up and make a difference in terms of, how you're able to set up the combo. So I do think this card is great for the purposes of getting the restand with Ramiel and, kind of high rolling your opponent, killing them while they're on grade 2, or even, after they've done their first grade 3 turn. When you're going second, you ride into Ramiel, you immediately do the restands with this. Your opponent's in a tough position. And because they heal a card, 1 per Razor that you activate, this means that going into their next turn, if they are forced to block, in many situations, the sweet spot numbers are 3 and 2 damage when they start with that. That means they'll usually have to block everything that you've got, even if they're at low damage, because they'll simply die if they take one of these attacks. Now, this also means that they'll be taking the Ramiel attack typically. So if you see that they've got rear guards still on the board after they've guarded the Sanitize Raisers, you can typically use Ramiel to attack the rear guard just to keep them at a lower damage than they would otherwise be if they're not protective enough about their rear guards. Although I will say my opponents did catch on to this without my ever attempting to do this, because they were able to intercept with their rear guards, or they just simply had no rear guards for me to attack into. So they would just always take the Ramiel actual attack, which is a bit of a bummer, but at the same time, you just got to have the preparations ready for that. Take those things into account when you're playing this deck. So that's my suggestion. And of course, if you don't want to run Sanitize Raiser, we'll get to the card that you can run alternatively after I finish the rest of the build. But this is a great option as our restander of choice, because it is such a great card for high rolling. But my one regret was not running the 4th copy, because I'll tell you guys a secret right now. I faced Vanquisher round 1. One of the worst matchups that Angel Feather can pair into round 1, especially with a deck like this, which is relying extremely on these combo pieces being existent in numerous copies. So having the 3 Sanitize Raisers was truly punishing against Vanquisher, where my Sanitize Raiser was bound basically right away after I did my first grade 3 turn. So keep that in mind, guys. Finally, for the grade 2 lineup, we've got 3 copies of Raguel. This card I think can be cut for some other grade 2s, but we're going to get to those soon. But the only reason I'm really saying that, I think I'm kind of salty about it, because I literally never drew this card except for once, exactly once, despite running the 3 copies. And the one time I did draw into it was just to get a Sanitized Razor back that had been attacked into. And that could have been, avoided by simply running an additional copy of Sanitized Razor. So with that being said, I think this card can just be completely cut from the deck. But my main idea for running this was to bring back a Bellyful Meds Angel that had been previously used, just so that we can get the additional value out of that card without actually having additional copy in our deck. So this card functions as an additional copy for cards like Bellyful Meds Angel, like Scaling Angel as well, and even cards like Sariel, which sometimes you don't see every single copy of Sariel, and you need those additional searches for something like Narelle or Ramiel. So this card can accomplish that with stuff that's already in your drop zone that you've already used previously in the game. So I really like it. In theory, it's supposed to be a good card for those purposes I just said, but in actuality, I just saw it only once, and I was a bit bummed about it. So I do think it can definitely be cut for other stuff that's available, and we'll get to those soon, hopefully. But keep that in mind for a card like this. It's supposed to be a good fit because it has Celestial in its name, incidentally, which means it can be searched off of Narelle. But, you know, did that actually happen? I regret to say it never really came up, unfortunately. All right, now for the grade 3s, we've got 4 copies of the main unit of the deck, Prophecy Celestial Ramiel. So this card is actually very good, and you know, unfortunately, you have to build a deck around it for her to be good, similar to Cassiel. But the difference between Cassiel and this card is that Cassiel is a lot more generic. This card, I mean, of course, this card doesn't require celestial names, but the simply the fact that it requires you to set up the same names in your damage zone as names that you'd have on your rearguard circles in order to get the restand means that you have to work a lot harder in order for actual kill power than some other decks that are around this meta. Steam Maidens, you didn't hear me say Steam Maidens, right? But you know, Angel Feather's naturally a clan that has to kind of work differently in terms of how you kill your opponent, and Ramiel is kind of an awkward implementation of that, and you do have to go through hoops and hurdles to accomplish this. But you're rewarded with a very powerful restander when paired with the right cards, such as Sanitize Raiser or Hygienist Angel, which we'll go over pretty soon here. But one of the weaknesses of this card is that it does Soul Blast, which means you got to continuously have the soul available in order to restand every turn, which means, you know, the later you get into the game, the less likely you're going to be favored just because you're going to eventually run out of resources, unfortunately. But the nice thing is that if you continue to see multiple copies of Ramiel, make sure to call them to the rearguard circle because you do get additional value out of them. If you're at 4 damage, you get a free +1 at the beginning of your ride phase, and you get a card back into your soul. So those are all great things about it. But sometimes it's also just better to re-ride. You know, just use the Vanguard's ability, the Vanguard version of the ability, for that same effect. You know, you get a +1. Top card goes to your damage zone face up. Then you use a card from your damage zone, put it in your hand, and then you could just re-ride with one of the Ramiels that's already in your hand, you know, maybe because you didn't have it already on the field or you drew into it or whatever, right? But the whole idea is that the more of these you have, the better of a card it becomes. It's as simple as that, pretty much. And, you know, it's important to also set up with the right cards. Sometimes setting up with Sanitize Raisers isn't always the way to go. Sometimes you do want to set up with just whatever you have on the field, simply because, you know, you're not always able to get all the combo pieces exactly as you need. I happened to always get them in every single round last weekend, which was nice, but even with that, I wasn't able to win every single round. Of course, my first round was against Vanguard, so I mean, that's just a bad matchup no matter what. There's nothing you can really do about that. In round 2, I faced Chronojet, so that was, you know, I mean, I'll go over that. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but again, you know, this card being the restander and giving you some card draw, plus giving all your rear guards a huge power buff, just makes it, you know, the quintessential boss unit for Celestials, and it does its job really well as far as Celestials are concerned. But Celestials are an archetype are still kind of missing something, so you know, this card can only take you so far, and you know, we're gonna try to make as much out of it as we can, but in the end, guys, you know, there probably are better boss units to build around. So, you know, Kirio's a pretty good one, as you guys probably saw in the previous deck profile / locals report. So, but this is what we got. So 4 copies of Ramiel. And last but not least, we got 1 copy of Ramiel Reverse. So Ramiel Reverse, I regret to say that I literally never rode this card last weekend. The whole idea is that if you open this after the mulligan, you discard it with Scaling Angel or whatever you ride. Basically, discard it at some point, right? And then eventually, using Scaling Angel, you put it back in the damage zone. And then at the beginning of the ride phase, you use Ramiel's ability to put a card from the top of your deck into your damage zone, and then put a card from damage zone into your hand. You'd add this to the hand and then ride it over the Ramiel, finish them off on that turn. But the problem with this is that Ramiel, honestly, with Sanitize Raiser, is just a better finisher in general. So you really never need this. And, you know, I never had an opportunity to ride it because I was just simply dead. So this card was just basically a dead card every time I had it in my hand. And even in the damage zone, it was a dead card because it was doing nothing. So I would have rather had it in the drop zone the whole game than having it in anywhere else. Basically, I wouldn't want to have it in my deck. I wouldn't have wanted to have it in my hand or damage zone. So it was a dead card quite often, and I probably should have replaced this with something else before the local began. But I wanted to believe that this card was the finisher that it was intended to be clearly, but it's just not needed, guys. It really isn't. If you really want a card that is worded like a finisher, you can run Lamido, you can run Amputation Angel with Protect 2. There are a lot of good options, guys, for finishers that are actually meant to be finishers. This card is not it. Ramiel does a way better job of finishing with the restanders that I've presented before with this deck, as well as the previous Celestial builds. So just use those. Honestly, I'm definitely going to be cutting this in the future, unless they somehow make this card good with future Angel Feather support. But for the moment, for the time being, it's just not it. And that's actually it for the deck, guys. Yeah, 5 grade 3s. That's all you really need, to be honest. And you can even run 4, as I've been kind of hinting at here. But let's kind of go over some additional cards that you can potentially run in favor of some other things that I mentioned can be cut in this build. So to start off, I mentioned earlier in the grade 1 lineup that there are additional cards that you can run in order to have the utility necessary to make the combo a bit more stable and consistent. One of those is a copy or multiple copies of Hezadiel. The nice thing about Hezadiel is that it's also a celestial name, which means it's searchable off of Narelle, and of course it's also searchable off of Sariel as usual, but that's not really a good use of Sariel. But basically, because this card is a celestial, it works with all those names as aforementioned, and also because it activates on place from hand without there being a restriction or stipulation on a once per turn. This means that you can just on demand call it from your hand and swap. Of course, you need a counterblast available, but for this deck that's no problem because we're not really using counterblast. We're not really permanently leaving cards in the damage zone face down. That's how I should put it, because Celestials have many ways to countercharge, including Ramiel herself. So this card is great for getting the names that you need in your damage zone, as well as just providing some utility if you need to swap in some extra defenders or etc. Technically, it's generic as well, so it's really nice for that. Another card that you can run in the grade 2 lineup, and a card that I cut from the previous build when I last did a Celestial deck profile, is Danielle. The problem with Danielle is that it doesn't actually, like, the card is almost kind of bait. I'm gonna be real. Like, it sounds like it's good in Celestial, but the problem is you rarely actually want to call directly from the deck to your field. With Angel Feathers, it's often just better to add it straight to your hand, because sometimes you want the when placed from hand abilities, because some cards do have only when placed from hand, and also just the fact that you're discarding a card as cost, which makes it a little just it makes you feel bad when you use this card to search out the card that you're looking for that's in your damage zone from your deck, because oftentimes it's just better to get it straight to hand or just straight to the damage zone. You don't really want to call it from deck. Not to mention the fact that this card forces you to counterblast 2 if you don't call a celestial card, which is just such a punishing condition, especially since we do such a good job of leaving cards face up with most of the celestial cards, and then this card decides to suddenly leave 2 counterblast face down. Really disappointing, and which part of the reason why I cut it. And then another reason why I cut it as well is just that we're kind of tight on the grade 2 space, and I wanted to experiment with Raguel. Obviously Raguel didn't really satisfy me last weekend, but it's still, I think, better than Danielle, this card right here. So it's still an option for your grade 2s, potential grade 2s that you can run for Celestial. And maybe at some point when Celestial gets more support in the future, hopefully, Danielle will become a better card. But I'm not feeling it anymore, so I've taken it out for the time being. But you can definitely decide to test this out and run it yourself if you feel like you find any cards that work perfectly well with Danielle. Last but not least, we've got a restander option you can run instead of Sanitize Raiser, which is Hygienist Angel. This card has a very simple ability, and it reads Continuous Rearguard Circle. It gets +5 for each card in your damage zone. That is both on your turn and your opponent's turn, because it does not specify which turn it gets the power buff, which means that if your opponent tries to attack into it, well, it's going to be a lot harder for them, because this card is going to be usually at least 17k, perhaps even 22k or even 27k, as much as 32k, in fact, late game. So it's not going to be as easy to remove as Sanitize Raiser can be, because they can attack into Sanitize Raiser since it's simply an AK card. But for Hygienist Angel, it's going to be a lot harder to do. They have to have more traditional removals, such as retiring, bottom decking, binding, whatever removal that the clan has available that you're facing. They're probably going to use that against this card instead of attacking into it, because it's just harder to remove it by attacking into it. There's good reason to run this instead of Sanitize Razor if you expect the matchups to be longer overall at whatever tournament you're going to. This card is a lot better because it scales extremely well into the late game, better than Sanitize Razor, I would say. Sanitize Razor has better high roll potential, which I think is better valued for this sort of meta right now. But at the same time, if you want to cover some of the weaknesses that it has during the curve of, turn 1, 2, 3, and then on, then it's good to run Hygienist Angel because it scales extremely well into those turns, however long the game goes. Now, Hygienist Angel also gives you a good excuse to run more crits in the deck, just because it doesn't inherently have more than one crit. So chances are you might want to add more crits, such as Black Spark Moon Car or whatever other crits are available. And V Critical Angel is another one, just to be able to buff your Hygienist Angels a little more and make them a bit more threatening, because sometimes your opponent just simply doesn't respect them. But at the same time, having Hygienist Angel over the Sanitize Razor makes your deck a little bit more normal. Again, it removes kind of the high roll that you have when you're going first and your opponent's on grade 2. They're most certainly not going to die a lot of the time, because they'll take the damage. Let's say at worst case they'll be at 4 or 5 damage, and they might be able to kill you on the following turn if you're not careful. But at the same time, if you do survive, then putting them at 5 damage is great, because these Hygienist Angels might even win the game at that point if you've taken enough damage for them to be boosted high enough. So there's a lot of good reasons to run either of them. I wouldn't say that Hygienist Angel is strictly better over Sanitize Razor or vice versa, but there's good reason to run them based on the meta or based on how high roll or well balanced you want to make the deck in general. I have no regrets personally for running Sanitize Razor over Hygienist Angel for this build and for the locals last weekend, but my one regret was running 3 instead of 4 of the respective restanders. So there is that to be said. So that does it for all the tech cards I considered for this build. Now, as with the previous build, you can also run Aculeus, but Aculeus costs more souls, so that's why I didn't even bother to pull that card out for an additional option. Soul is already hard to come by for this build, so I don't think we need more cards that burn the soul on attack, because that's double the amount of soul that would be burnt from a card like Sanitize Razor, which is simply an activated ability rather than an on-attack ability. Alright, so that's going to do it for the deck profile. There's one more thing I want to touch on, which is just kind of the report of how the locals went. So, as I said, I went 1 and 2 with the deck. There were 3 rounds at the local. There were a total of, I believe there were 7 people. I faced round 1 into Vanquisher. Very unfortunate pairing because, as it goes with a lot of angel effects, and especially this one, which really needs combo pieces in order to be able to make any kind of offense. Even though I went first, even though I had the first grade 3 turn, clearly wasn't able to kill him. So basically died as soon as he rode to grade 3. I did not die exactly that turn, but my following, turn with Ramiel was just so underwhelming because I restood only 1 card, and it was just like humiliating because my combo pieces have gotten bound, and there's not really much else to be said about the Vanquisher or even any other Narukami match because it's just going to be bad no matter what for this deck. So that was my round 1. And then round 2, I faced Chronojet, so Gear Chronicle. And I also went first for that one. And, similar to the Vanquisher game, I got the full combo set up with the 3 Sanitize Razor and the 2 Sariel boosting. But the thing is, for this game, my opponent had basically they didn't have a sufficient enough defense. They were left with 2 cards in hand going into their first grade 3 turn, and they also didn't have heal guardians, so they actually would have died if not for 2 heals that they had pulled throughout the damage checks off of the 2 Sanitize Razor attacks. By the way, these Sanitize Razors were swinging twice each for 3 critical when he was on grade 2, without any heal guardians or PGs as far as I recall. So really brutal. This is the kind of high roll I'm talking about, guys, where you could really rob games when everything goes your way. And it's honestly not super hard to get the full, high roll with 3 Sanitize Razor in rotation, along with the 2 Sariel. It's obviously not easy. You do have to kind of mulligan for it and have things go your way in some respects, some aspects. But you can also build your deck to allow that to happen more frequently, which is what I kind of regret not doing. But having it simply available is just going to make your opponent scared to death, and as they should be, because in the case of my opponent in round 2, the Chronojet player, they literally had to try to kill me on their first grade 3 turn. And their first grade 3 turn, while they're able to somehow assemble a full board, it just wasn't it just wasn't enough to finish me off when I was at 2 damage. When they started their turn. And the only reason I was at 2 damage was because they crit on one of their turns when I had taken the damage. So if not for that, I would have been actually at 1 damage, which obviously would not have been enough for the full restanders to go through on Ramiel. So that is a piece of matchup advice, guys. If you do want to just completely avoid the high roll entirely, then you can decide to just give me no more than 1 damage. And at that point, there's simply nothing I can do. There are only a few cards available in the clan that can actually buff my damage up enough such that I can get the full setup of of um, restanders. 4 is the ideal number because it gives you the full 10k to your whole board of rear guards and allows 4 rear guards to restand, since they would ideally all be ones that are named in the damage zone, but the most you can do that with is having 2 cards in damage zone with 4 rear guards, 2 of them being the same copies as each other. Let me just pull out, because I did promise that I would show an example board of that, because that will make it a lot easier to explain rather than my just rambling on about the setup, the ideal setup, the optimal high roll. Better to have something concrete so that you guys understand what I'm getting at. So here we've got, you guys can't see this too well. There we go. All right, so Sanitize Razor's in front, Sariel's in the back, simply because it's likely that we use the Sariels to search out the cards that we were missing. So those would likely be the cards that would be in the back row. And since they can probably boost in most cases, since we don't really leave face down cards in the damage zone, this means that they're ideal in the back row like they are here. So in the damage zone, we've got Sanitize Razor and Sariel. And then, of course, in the Vanguard circle, you've got Ramiel. So this is your ideal board setup, which we call the high roll. You'd have cards in soul, of course, but you would have spent them for Sanitize Razors, Sariels, whatever else you need to get this board ready. And then, of course, you need 1 additional card in soul for your Ramiel attack. The whole idea is you attack with these. So this is going to be 18, 3 crit, boosted by this, which just makes it 27, 27. And then you attack with this, Soul Blast, restand everything, because we all have names that exist in the damage zone. And each of these get plus 10, which means your columns are going to be boosted by 20. So this is going to be 47, 47, plus whatever you drive check. And don't forget that you also draw 2 because you restood 4. So this is the ideal board, right? This was the board I was able to high roll my opponent with in round 2. And pretty much I did this every round, actually. It's just that, I didn't kill off of the turn in any of the rounds. But in round 2, it just happened to be enough to, put the opponent in a position where they had to kill me before my next turn came back. And, of course, they weren't able to. So the whole idea, as I was, trying to get at before getting sidetracked by showing you guys the board, how it looks like visually, is that if you're facing this deck, you don't really want to give me more than 1 damage because you want to make me work for it. Now, if you're thinking like, oh yeah, then how do I deal with people that give me no more than 1 damage? Well, guys, the thing is, sometimes you can decide to change your deck build a little bit if you feel like there's gonna be such opponents that are playing against you like this. So one card you can decide to run, and I guess I lied by saying that those are the only cards you can decide. Obviously, there's plentiful cards that you can decide to run. Aside from the cards I already showed before with Hygienist, Danielle, and Hezadiel. Yophiel is a good one because not only does it have Celestial in its name, but it allows you to give yourself an extra damage for potentially getting another name that you need in order to restand stuff, and then also gives you another card to hand at the end of the turn. The problem with Yophiel though is that it would have been so good if this card somehow worked with Ramiel in terms of getting Ramiel's second ability online when you have the 4 or more damage, but sadly it just doesn't work like that. So I am not running this card in Celestial despite its having a Celestial name, because I do not think this card is actually meant for Celestial, interestingly enough. I think this card was more so meant to push Hamiel back when that was still around in V, and it just so happened that on Bushiroad's website they actually kind of mentioned using Yophiel as a way of getting the 3 damage to get the Hamiel Guard Restrict. Now, I could not tell you where on Bushiroad's website that was because, I just don't remember off the top of my head, but I did see that at one point, and of course, rest in peace, Hamiel. You brought us so much in V, and it's unfortunate that you had to leave, but as it goes, you can't have good stuff for too long with Angel Feather. That's just the way it is. Another card that I was getting towards was Holy Seraph Nociel. You can use that as the other card to kind of get yourself the second damage in case your opponent doesn't give you all the damage. The problem with Holy Seraph Nociel is that you have to run 4 copies of it because it inherently only works with Nociel cards. Sorry about that. It inherently only works with Nociel cards, right? So if you don't run 4 copies of it, and also if you simply run it just to give the extra damage, it's going to be a clunky card oftentimes. Not to mention the fact that it costs us another soul as well. It's just can't catch a break with Angel Feather in cards that need Soul Blast in order to work in V. But yeah, so that's why we're not running Holy Seraph Nociel in this deck either. But anyway, what I was getting at, basically, because I high rolled my Chronojet opponent, he was not able to survive the subsequent turn. And of course, I had enough soul for all of this because I actually saw my Bellyful Meds Angels and my Scaling Angels, which unfortunately I did not see a single one of either of those 2 cards in my round 3, which I faced Gurguit. And honestly, I really would have beaten my Gurguit opponent if I had simply had 2 more cards in soul, because I had I had gone second in that game, right? But I had not only gotten the full high roll as you see right here with the 2 Sanitize Raisers backed by Sariel, but I had also, gotten him to 3 or 4 damage, whatever it was. Although he had enough perfect cards in his hand. He had 3 perfect cards the first time I did this turn, so he would have simply just not survived the second time. The problem was the subsequent turn, I just didn't have enough cards soul. Not only did I not have enough Ramiel to rewrite into, but I also just didn't have Bellyful Meds or Scaling Angel at all that whole game. So didn't have enough soul, and these 2 were just vanilla 8Ks, hoping to try to catch my opponent off guard by somehow finding a crit, which I actually did find some crits, but again, they just weren't enough because he could just take the damage since I healed him in the prior turn, and he was able to guard with the perfect cards. He was able to take the damage subsequent turns since they weren't really that threatening. So yeah, that's kind of how the tournament went. I went 1-2. Of course, fighting Vanquisher first round did kind of throw things out of whack, I would say, but all the same, I did have opportunities to win the other 2 rounds, and it just didn't happen for one of those rounds. So 1-2 is the record I ended up with, and yeah, that's how this deck performs. So kind of my overall thoughts about this deck. I do think Celestials have something cool that going for them, and this build is kind of an example of that. But I do think there are further things that they might need in order to get themselves to the right amount of power to match the stuff that exists right now, just because there's just kind of too many moving parts in order to get this deck working, and there's simply a high chance that things don't work out the way as planned, even with a more optimal build than this, because I do think that this build is not necessarily the best version of Celestials that can be run, but is the version that that I had time to put together before the locals this past weekend. So but yeah, guys, that's basically all that I have for this video. If you did enjoy the video, please feel free to leave a like and a comment and subscribe for more Vanguard content. And if you enjoy a lot of these kinds of videos like this, like Angel Feather deck profiles, deck analyses, deck reports, please, leave a comment and let me know what you guys think about these kinds of videos. And if there are too many Angel Feather videos, should I give them a break for now, or bring them on, give me more Angel Feather ideas, that kind of thing? Just do let me know in the comments, and I'll try to adjust my frequency of these kinds of videos in the near future. So with all that, thanks you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.